Welcome back to Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we embark on the next chapter of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Join us as we navigate these enlightening teachings. Meticulously curated by our team, this audiobook is a conduit for Buddha's wisdom. Your help in spreading these teachings is vital. Subscribe, like, and share to amplify their reach. Let's collectively enrich the world with the profound guidance of Buddha. Relax and absorb the essence of these teachings as we dive into today's Success on the Path. January 13, 2009. To stay with the breath, you first have to want to stay with the breath. It's the first basis of success in the practice. Some people object to the idea that there's success and failure in the practice. But this is a path that leads to a goal. That's something we always should keep in mind. That we're going someplace. Willy-nilly, we're going someplace. We're heading to aging, illness and death, but you want to ask yourself, is that the place you want to head? Or the only place you want to head? The body does have to age, grow ill and die, but does the mind have to do that? Does the mind have to suffer from those things? Is there a place where you can go where you don't suffer from those things? As the Buddha said, it's not found by going anywhere in the physical universe. But it is found by going inside. And the fact that there is that possibility, that potential for going in a direction that doesn't age, doesn't ill, doesn't die. That's why we have the Buddha's path. That's why there are the right factors of the path, and the wrong factors of the path. And that's why there's success and failure. If it were the case that there wasn't that potential for putting an end to suffering, that life was simply a matter of learning how to accept what's already here, then the practice would be very different. But what the Buddha is asking you to do is to accept something else, that there is a potential to put an end to suffering. And it's going to demand a lot out of you. There is one place where he says that even if the practice involves suffering to the point where there are tears streaming down your cheeks, you stick with it, because the path ultimately does lead to a goal that more than makes up for all the tears. The few tears running down your cheeks are very few compared to all the tears you've been shedding already. If you drive up Interstate 5 along the coast and look out across the Pacific Ocean, you realize that there's a huge amount of water there. It stretches out to the horizon, and you know it goes far beyond that. And yet the amount you see is nothing compared to all the water in all the oceans, and all the water in all the oceans is nothing compared to the volume of the tears you've been shedding over all these many lifetimes. If you don't follow the path, there are probably going to be that many more tears waiting for you in the future. So there are two reasons to have the desire to focus on the path. One is realizing that the path leads you away from a lot of suffering. There are many comparisons in the canon. The Buddha picked up a little bit of dirt under his fingernail one time and said, "Which is greater, the dirt under my fingernail, or the dirt in the earth?" Of course, the dirt in the earth was much greater. He said, in the same way, for someone who has seen the Dharma, has broken through the experience of the Dharma, in other words gained the first level of awakening, the amount of suffering that remains for that person is like the dirt under the fingernail. Whereas the amount of suffering that awaits those who haven't is like the dirt in all the earth. So that's one reason for following the path, is that it's a way to avoid an awful lot of suffering. The other reason for engendering desire for the path is that it's a good path, and it leads to a really good destination. The destination is something we can't see yet, but we can see the path. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action. Right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. These are all good things to do. The Buddha is not asking you to do anything that you'd be ashamed of, not asking you to do anything that's going to be harmful to anybody. He's asking you to develop good, honest, upright qualities of the mind, things you can be proud that you can develop. So as you think about the rewards of the practice, and all the dangers that the practice takes you away from, it can help give energy to your practice. This is why recollection of the Dharma is one of the recollections the Buddha recommends. He says that when you're focusing on one of the frames of reference, or establishing mindfulness based on the body, feelings, mind, mental qualities, there may come times when the practice starts getting difficult. As he says, there may be a fever in the body or a fever in the mind. That, he says, is when it's good to put that topic aside and think about something inspiring. And the practices he recommends that are inspiring are recollection of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, recollection of your own generosity, virtue, recollection of the qualities of the devas, thinking about the fact that you've been developing those qualities as well. And you think about those themes as much as you need to get rid of that fever in the body and the fever in the mind, to get the mind feeling inspired and uplifted. In this way you develop the desire to get back on the path. It's not that these recollections are off the path, but they're supplementary reflections. They can get you back into the practice of right mindfulness, right effort, and on into right concentration. When things start getting dry, remember that it's wise to gladden the mind to give rise to that sense of desire. It's part of learning how to read your own mind, to diagnose its diseases, and then provide the medicine it needs. If the desire is lacking, stop and think. What would your life be like if there were no prospect of putting an end to suffering? Think of how fortunate we are that we have the path, that it hasn't been forgotten. We don't have to forge the path ourselves in a very uncertain world. Think about the Buddha, about how uncertain things were at his time. A lot of people were saying that there was no way to put an end to suffering, that you should just accept things as they are. Others were saying that there was an end to suffering, but nothing you could do about it. It was just going to happen naturally, just like a ball of string unwinding, and eventually you'd get to the end of the string. But in the meantime, you've got to put up with all the suffering that's entailed in what remains of the string. The Buddha had the courage not to accept either of those ideas. He thought, maybe there is something that can be accomplished through human effort. And so he put his life on the line to test that idea. At present we have the example of many people in the past, the Buddha himself and all of his noble disciples. So it's not quite so uncertain. We may still have our doubts about it, but at least there's a path laid out. And a lot of very honest and upright people have said that it works. When the practice gets dry, it's useful to think about these things, so that you can work through any hesitation you may have in focusing on the breath or any reluctance, any sense of weariness. As Ajahn Fuang said, you lubricate the mind, so that it doesn't seize up the way an engine would seize up when it runs out of lubricant. You give rise to the desire to stick with the path. From that desire develops persistence, the energy, the stick-to-itiveness that's required in training the mind. After all, the mind has a lot of old habits, and it's going to take time and persistence to deal with these things. So it's important to learn how to give yourself energy all along the way. Persistence, as Ajahn Lee says, goes together with your powers of endurance. And the best way is to keep yourself on the path, keep yourself strong on the path, is not to weigh yourself down with unnecessary doubts about yourself, unnecessary complaints about how difficult things are. It's always good to focus on where things are going well, and not to keep obsessing about the things that are difficult or wearisome. We may distrust the Pollyanna approach of always looking for the bright side, but it makes the practice a lot lighter to keep reminding yourself that there are a lot of positive things about being on this path. And you find that they give you energy. You can save your doubts for your defilements. Learn how to be skeptical about your defilements. In other words, you really look at them and question the assumptions that get in the way of the practice. Of course, that means you have to learn how to recognize them. This is where the quality of siddha or intent interest comes in. As you give yourself to the practice, look to see what keeps pulling you back. What nagging doubts do you have? What complaints does the mind have? Learn to question them. This is where siddha merges in with the mansa, your powers of analysis, your powers of discrimination, your ability to question the thoughts that come into your mind. You can ask yourself, exactly where does that thought come from? Can you identify the person who in your past would think in that way? Can you identify the tone of the voice that thinks in that way? Is it a tone of voice that you want to adopt? And you can look at that thought in terms of the issue of freedom. Do you want to be a slave to that kind of thinking? This is one of the reasons we try to keep the mind with the breath. so that it can look at its thoughts with a certain of detachment, from a certain amount of distance, get some perspective on them. One really effective way of dealing with them is to refuse to go along with them and see how they complain. Then ask them, why should I believe that complaint? And try to see what kind of reasons that part of the mind comes up with. Keep pushing your questioning until you find the point where the reasons break down. When you can develop these 4 bases for success, you're in a position where you can be your own teacher, read the situation in the mind and not fall for it. Or to use another analogy, you're your own doctor. Learn to recognize the illness and recognize the cause of the illness and give the right medicine, because as the Buddha said, he merely points out the way. It's up to you to follow it. As a doctor, he is the one who prescribed the medicine. It's for you to find the various herbs that he prescribes and then to take the medicine. The Buddha can't give you a shot and cure your illness, but he can tell you what the right herbs are and how you take them. And he gives you some explanation of the cause of the illness, so you can understand how the herbs are related to the cause. In other words, he teaches you how to become your own doctor. So try to develop this sense of what's needed to be your own doctor, to be your own teacher, so that at the very least, the dialogue in your mind can be more helpful, more intelligent, more wise, and actually head in that direction that we want to go, to the end of suffering. At the very least, test to see if what the Buddha had to say is true. The only way you're going to know is if you give it a good, honest, serious test. If you don't give it that test, then all the sufferings of life begin to move in on you. They don't promise a way out at all. The denial of any way out. That's what's so insistent about the way life normally is. And that defilements that go along with that denial are what keep us trapped. So we owe it to our desire for happiness to give the path a serious try. And to try to develop whatever qualities are needed to see us through. Inconstancy. January 16, 2009. One of the basic principles of insight or clear seeing is that all compounded or all fabricated things are inconstant. They don't last. They waver. They change. And as someone once said, so what else is new? Things change. And if that's all there was to the Buddha's insight, there wouldn't be much to it. But it goes deeper than that. It's not just that things change, but that things change in line with their conditions. And you want to be able to see that changing in line with their conditions. In other words, to see that this arises when that arises, this ceases when that ceases. Even that's not much of an insight until you realize that we're also trying to feed in those areas where things arise and pass away. We're looking for our happiness there. And if we look for happiness in these things in and of themselves, we're going to be disappointed. And if we can't figure out the pattern, we are going to be neurotic. I once read about a test they ran on some pigeons. They put each of them in a box, and in each box there was a green lever and a red lever. In some of the boxes, when you pushed the green lever, you'd get food, and sometimes when you pushed it, you wouldn't get food. Sometimes when you pushed the red lever, you'd get food and sometimes you wouldn't. Then they compared the birds in these boxes with another set of birds placed in boxes where the levels behaved in a predictable way. When you pushed the green level, you'd food. When you pushed the red level, you wouldn't. The birds in the second set of boxes were perfectly normal. The birds in the first set of boxes went crazy and began behaving in very neurotic ways for 2 reasons. One was the only way they were going to get food was by pressing levers. And yet, too, they couldn't figure out when a lever was going to work and when it wasn't. That drove them to distraction. So as long as we're looking for food in things that arise and pass away, we've got to learn the pattern of how we're going to get good food for the mind from these arising and passing away things. This is part of the Buddha's other insight into inconstancy. That even though some things arise and pass away and can't give an ultimate happiness in and of themselves, they do function as a path to the ultimate happiness, whereas other things don't. This is the pattern. The things that can function as a path to true happiness are skillful. Those that don't are unskillful. An important part of insight is learning, through observation, which is which. So we look for inconstancy not just to see how things arise and pass away, but how we can learn how to manipulate the process so we can actually find the food that we want, and ultimately, of course, get to the point where we don't need food anymore. But the only way you get to that point is by feeding on the right things. This is why we meditate. When you start out meditating, and you see that states in your mind are arising and passing away, you're already dealing in what's called the frame of reference of mental qualities in and of themselves. Even though your focus is on the breath, you can't help but notice that there are times when the mind is concentrated on the breath and times when it's not. You've got to learn how to figure out both sides of the question. Which things are helping to foster concentration, and which things are getting in the way of concentration. And you have to learn how to encourage the first sort of conditions and get rid of the second. So even though we're focusing on the breath as our primary frame of reference, there's this other frame of reference going on at the same time. You have to learn how to recognize which qualities are hindrances and which are the factors for awakening. The hindrances are the primary set of unskillful qualities, the factors for awakening are the primary skillful ones. In fact, the factors of awakening are the ones that get you started on this path to begin with, for they help you in sorting all of these things out. The factors for awakening begin with mindfulness. Once you're mindful of the breath, for instance, you begin to see that there are skillful and unskillful qualities arising in the mind, and that you've got to learn how to distinguish them. That's called analysis of qualities, the second factor for awakening. Then you foster the effort to do away with the unskillful ones, and to encourage the skillful ones, which is the third factor for awakening. Persistence. So right there you've got the first three of the factors for awakening. You want to encourage that ability to observe your mind, because even though you're trying to stay with the breath, or trying to stay focused on the breath, you're not going to be able to do it unless you've got these other faculties helping you along. As Ajahn Lee explains it, analysis of qualities is directly connected with directed thought and evaluation, which are factors of jhana. Those are things you need to help you get into the meditation, to get solidly with the breath. So you're dealing with two different frames of reference right there. The body in and of itself and these mental qualities in and of themselves. So when any of the hindrances arise, sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and anxiety, or uncertainty, your first duty is simply to recognize them for what they are, to see that they are hindrances, and they deserve to be let go. That right there is quite an accomplishment, because for the most part, when a hindrance arises, we're already with it. We're on its side. For example, when sensual desire comes along, we see it as a good thing. We've got decades of Western psychology to prove that sensual desire can't be thwarted. If you thwart it, it turns into the thing and goes underground. At least that's what the mind tells itself when it decides it's going to go along with the desire. There are all kinds of reasons the mind can produce for its actions, but you've got to learn how to look past them and ask yourself, what does this desire actually do to the mind? This is not just a matter of watching it arise and pass away. You've got to see, when it arises, what does it bring along with it? What does it do? When it passes away, what's it like? And you begin to realize when it's present it really does cloud up the mind. It creates a lot of disturbance, a lot of stress, makes it impossible to stay with the breath. And you've got to decide whether you're on the side of the sensual desire or on the side of the breath. The same goes with ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and anxiety, uncertainty and doubt. You've got to decide whether you're on their side or on the side of the breath. And the best way to decide is just to watch these things, step back from them. Ask yourself, when they come, what comes along with them? When they go away, what goes away with them? And when they come, why do they come? What intentions underlie them? Can you trust those intentions? At this stage in the practice, this is how you use the principle of inconstancy. Not just watching things arise and pass away because, after all, you're trying to feed in these areas, so you want to find good food for yourself. What kind of food do the hindrances provide? If they give you bad food, poisonous food, spoiled food, what can you do to clear them out of the mind? So you're not engaged in just a passive watching, You watch with a purpose. You want to get past these things. A similar principle applies to the factors for awakening. Once you've analyzed things and seen what's skillful and unskillful, you've got to figure out why it is that the skillful qualities arise, when they're there, how you protect them, how you maintain them. In Ajahn Vuang's words, how you pracking them. The Thai word pracking means that you nurture them along, protect them, support them. So even though you know that they're inconstant, you try to use the principle of inconstancy, i.e., seeing that they depend on causes and conditions in order to nurture those conditions, because you know you're going to depend on them. These qualities are going to be your food on the path, the good kind of food that strengthens the mind. The Buddha compares the states of jhana to different kinds of food. You're off in a fortress at the edge of a frontier. The enemy is all around you, but you've got food in the fortress, so even though the enemy is laying siege, you still can stay well fed, strong, and keep up the fight. You've got water, rice, sesame seeds, all sorts of good food, all the way up to the fourth jhana, which is compared to butter, ghee, sugar, and honey. And because these things are good food, you don't just watch them arise and pass away. You do what you can to grow the food and then to keep the food, because without it, the practice dies. Only when you've used that food to strengthen your concentration, strengthen your insight, strengthen the tranquility of the mind, can you get to the point where you've fully mastered that process of cause and effect. That's when you turn to look at it and see, how far does it take me? It's brought you a long way, but it can take you only so far. You're not yet at the other shore. That's when you start looking at everything in terms of arising and passing away, and try to develop the dispassion that comes from not wanting to eat any of these things, even good food, anymore. The Buddha uses the word nibbida, which means disenchantment but also disgust, distaste. You've had enough of that food. That's when you can let go of everything. That's when there's final release. This is the stage where you treat all compounded things in the same way, whether they're obstacles or part of the path, because you don't need to feed anymore. The mind doesn't have any hunger. But as long as it still does have hunger, your relationship to inconstancy is going to be different. You want to be like those healthy, well-adjusted pigeons, knowing which lever gives food, and which lever gives no food, or which lever gives good food, and which lever gives bad. When you figure it out, you can really nurture yourself, really nourish yourself. Then the mind stays strong. So there are many stages in this understanding of inconstancy. Not just, oh, I saw concentration last night and I saw that it was inconstant, so I let it go, and that was that. What's next? That kind of insight goes nowhere. The insight that does go somewhere is the insight that sees, oh, when this arises, it arises because of this. When it passes away because of that. And if the this is a skillful quality, you want to nurture it. If it's an unskillful quality, you want to figure out the principle of cause and effect, so you can stay away, let these things go. Because you still need to feed properly. You've got to take care of yourself. You still have those 4 duties with regard to the 4 noble truths. The path is to be developed. Suffering is to be comprehended. The causes of suffering are to be abandoned, so that the cessation of suffering can be realized. So for the time being, you use the principle of inconstancy to figure out what are the causes for the path, and how you keep them going, even though they are inconstant. It's only when you get to the end of the path that the duties change. Ajahn Mun makes an interesting point. He says, there comes a point in the meditation where all 4 noble truths are one. What he means is they all come to have the same duty, whether it's stress or the path or whatever. It's all compounded. It's all inconstant. It's all to be abandoned. But as you practice, you need to know where you are in the practice, and what the duties appropriate to that stage in the practice are. That's how you use insight into inconstancy with wisdom and discernment, so the teaching fulfills its intended purpose. The Will to Awaken. January 22, 2009. There's a passage where the Buddha describes his knowledge of the fate of other people, or the destinations of other people. He says it's like watching a man walking along a path that doesn't fork off in any other direction. It goes straight to one destination. And the Buddha notes that if the man continues to follow that path, he's going to end up at that destination. Notice, it's contingent on the man's continuing on that path. After all, he might choose not to follow that path. He might change his mind, turn around. There's another passage where the Buddha is asked, is the whole world going to release? Half the world? A third? And he refuses to answer. Ananda, who's afraid that the man who asked the question is going to get upset, takes the man aside and says, it's like a gatekeeper to a fortress. There's only one gate to the fortress. The gatekeeper walks around the fortress, and he doesn't see even the slightest opening in the fortress wall, not even one big enough for a cat to slip through. So he comes to the conclusion he doesn't know how many people are going to come into the fortress, how many people will leave the fortress, but he does know that if they're going to come in or leave, they have to go through the gate. Again, the point here is that we have the choice to go into the gate or not go into the gate. It's up to us. It's a free choice. It's not imposed on us by our nature. We have to will it. To get on the path to awakening, you have to desire it. It's an act of will. It's a truth of the will. William James talks about two kinds of truths. Truths of the observer and truths of the will. A truth of the observer is the type where you see cause and effect that are totally independent of your desire for them to be in a certain way. Knowledge about astronomy, say, or about the laws of nature. You have to take your desire out of the equation if you're going to see these truths. You have to be, as much as possible, a non-interfering observer. You interfere a little bit here and there in order to test cause and effect, to see exactly what cause is connected to what effect, but you have to accept the results whether you like them or not. If your likes get in the way, you're not really going to see those truths. Truths of the will, however, are a different matter entirely. You have to want them to be true in order for them to become true. If you're going to become a good pianist, a good carpenter, you have to want those things in order for them to happen. It helps if you have some natural inclination in that direction or some natural talents. But to be really good, you have to have a strong desire. Without that desire, they're not going to happen. In this case, your likes and dislikes are important. They're actually a part of the truth. This is the way it is with the path. We're not here just simply watching things passively. What we're learning is not a truth of the observer, it's a truth of the will. Awakening is something that has to be pursued. The deathless, of course, is not created by your desire. But the path is. It's something fabricated. When you look at the qualities that lead to awakening, things like the 10 perfections, they come under the headings of what the Buddha talks of as the Adhitthana Dhamma, things that are willed. There are actually 4. Discernment, truth, relinquishment, and peace or calming. All of these are things that we have to will in order to find them. Now the problem with will, of course, is it can be blind, which is why discernment comes first. You want to will discernment for it to happen. It's not a question of whether you're born smart or not smart. It comes from developing 2 qualities. One is having conviction. Again, this is where that issue of the truth of the will comes in. You have to be convinced that this is a worthwhile activity. Trying to develop your discernment, trying to find awakening. You have to be convinced that it's possible. If you don't believe it's possible, it's not going to happen. It's like the person stuck in the woods. If you don't believe that there's a path out of the woods, you're not going to try to look for it. If you don't try to look for it, you're not going to find it. So conviction that your actions really do make a difference, conviction that the Buddha really did gain awakening. These are an important part of discernment. The 5 strengths that end in discernment begin with conviction. As one of the Ajahns in Thailand once said, it's not the case that discernment begins with perceptions or ideas or concepts. It begins with conviction that there is a way out and that it can be found through your own actions. The other aspect of discernment is that you see what the important questions are. As the Buddha said, the big question is seeing where there's suffering, where there's stress, what's causing it, and what actions put an end to it. Those are the important questions in life. When you learn how to focus on those, it cuts through a lot of garbage. And then when you look at what qualities need to be developed in order to put an end to suffering, you find that there are also qualities required to improve your discernment. You need to develop more mindfulness, more alertness, more concentration. And part of that quest for the end of suffering involves goodwill for yourself, goodwill for the people around you, because you realize that if your happiness depends on their suffering, it's not going to happen. They're going to try to block it or undo it. So you have to find a happiness that's harmless to everybody. So that's the first thing you will. The will to discernment. It helps you see what goal is a good goal, and also what is clearly a good way to attain that goal. You're going to have to learn a lot of this path on your own as you go along. It's something you discover. All too often we read a book saying what it's going to be like. You're going to gain this insight, and then that insight. The problem is, when you've read those descriptions, you can force the mind in such a position that it starts having those insights. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're true, that they're genuine insights. You have to learn how to be more observant on your own, more alert, to see what insights actually bring freedom from suffering. This means you have to look all around you, and all around your insights. As Ajahn Lee once said, when you gain an insight, you have to turn it over to see to what extent it really is true, to what extent it's false, to what extent the opposite would be true. Only then can you know that you're not just programming yourself or trying to clone what you've read. Again, that would be a case of trying to make your discernment grow from your concepts, as opposed to the conviction there's got to be a way out. You've got to find that way for yourself, with the Buddha's directions of course, but it's based on your own powers of mindfulness and alertness, so you catch yourself to make sure that your defilements don't get in the way. So that's how we will discernment. The next thing we will is truthfulness. Part of truthfulness is the quality of self-honesty. As the Buddha said, let a person come who is honest and no deceiver, and I'll teach that person the Dhamma. This is the first prerequisite for getting on the path. To be truthful. This doesn't mean just telling the truth, but also means deciding which you've got to do and sticking with it, being true to your intentions. This is where the precepts or virtue as a perfection comes in. Once you've realized that you don't want to harm anybody, you've got to follow through and really abstain from activities that are harmful, whether it's easy to abstain or not. Discernment helps here, in its practical mode. When you find that a precept goes against your desires, you've got to use your discernment to find ways of making yourself want to stick with it, making it easier to stick with it, learning to cast a jaundiced eye on your desires, realizing that they promise all kinds of things, but can you really trust them? You use your discernment to stay true to your intention, and to find skillful ways of taking the wind out of the sails of your unskillful desires. That way you can hang on to what you know is really in your best interests, and in the best interests of the people around you. The third thing that we have to will is relinquishment, learning how to let go. This is where the perfections of renunciation and giving come in. Giving here means giving away not only material things, but also our unskillful desires. Giving up our unskillful ways of holding on to things. Sometimes it comes naturally, easily, and sometimes it doesn't. And again, this is where you need to use your discernment, learning strategies to make you more and more inclined to give up things you have to give up, things that get in the way, the lesser pleasures that get in the way of greater happiness. This is not a matter of just giving up things that are obviously unskillful. I did a survey once on the topic of relinquishment in books of American Buddhism. In the few cases where they actually talk about relinquishment, they focus on relinquishing unhealthy relationships and relinquishing your controlling mindset. We don't really need the Buddha tell you relinquish those things. Your parents can tell you to relinquish unhealthy relationships. If you have a psychotherapist, the therapist will tell you to relinquish your controlling mindset. There are a lot of things that are really pleasurable, that society actually encourages you to look for, but the Buddha says, look, you've got to give them up as they lead to unhealthy attachments down the line. Your attachment to sensual pleasures and sensual desires. That's the big one. Your attachment to thoughts about, plans about sensual pleasures. That's what you have to learn how to renounce. An important step is learning to see the rewards of renunciation. It's not going to leave you deprived. It really is restful to the mind. It really gives peace to the mind. There's a famous story about the monk, a former king, sitting in the forest exclaiming, "What bliss! What bliss!" And it turns out he's not pining after the joys he felt when he was a king before he became a monk. He's exclaiming over how blissful he is now that he can sit under the tree without having to worry about all the people who wanted to kill him when he was a king, all the people who wanted to take away his pleasures and wealth. That's one of the pleasures of renunciation, that sense of freedom, and nobody's going to try to steal that from you. And as the monk said to the Buddha, his mind was now like a wild deer. It was free. You've got to learn how to think in those ways when the desire for sensuality really gets strong, to see that when you can renounce it, you're free. And again, you have to will that. It doesn't come naturally. As the Buddha once said, even he didn't find it easy to will renunciation. His mind didn't leap up at the idea. But his desire for a deathless happiness was strong enough, and he coupled it with the discernment that could help him find ways of reasoning with his mind, find tactics for giving the mind pleasures that didn't have to depend on sensuality, primarily the pleasure of jhana, the pleasure of concentration. When you have an alternative source of pleasure like that, you realize that you're trading candy for gold. But the ability to make that trade is something you have to will. The fourth thing is peace. The Pali word upasama also means stilling, or calm. And there are two perfections that are associated with that: patience and equanimity. The word patience can also mean endurance, the ability to put up with difficult things. Here again, you use your discernment to find strategies to strengthen that ability. One of the primary strategies is learning not to focus on the difficulty, but to find ways of encouraging yourself, giving yourself energy. This is closely related to relinquishment and renunciation. You learn how to see the areas, the advantages of enduring. The mind becomes stronger, it can live in more difficult situations. It's not such a slave to its desires as it was before. There's a freedom that comes with endurance. And equanimity, too, is something you have to will, the ability to stay unperturbed with the things you like and the things you don't like, not getting excited when things go well, not getting depressed when they don't. In other words, you train yourself to have a certain amount of independence. Discernment is needed to perfect and understand this quality, and the equanimity helps foster the discernment, allowing you to see things more clearly as well. The two qualities go hand in hand. There are times in the meditation where you do simply have to sit and watch. Some of your defilements really will go away just when you watch them, but not all of them. One of the points of developing equanimity is so you begin to see where the difference lies. So the Buddha is not recommending a blanket passivity here. He's telling you to develop equanimity when it's appropriate. You develop equanimity when you need to see things that you don't yet understand. When you understand, sometimes equanimity is still appropriate, and sometimes you need to do something more forceful to deal with the problem at hand. All of these are things we have to will if we want to make progress on the path. The if there is important. We're free to will these qualities, we're free not to. This is why the Buddha never talked about Buddha nature, the idea that somehow our inherent nature is going to lead us to awakening. We do have freedom though, the freedom to choose. And the Buddha was a great respecter of that freedom. It's a little scary to think about the fact that awakening is not inevitable, for it's so easy to fall off the path. Sometimes the idea of inevitable awakening is much more reassuring, but it will make us complacent, which is precisely the quality that will lead us astray. We need to develop the heedfulness that comes when we realize that we are free to choose, that we can make right choices and wrong choices, and that we have to live with the consequences. This is why the Buddha said that heedfulness is what lies at the basis of all that is skillful. So try to develop that and learn how to live with that, and not get scared by it. Learn how to make it energizing, so that it keeps you alert while at the same time developing this sense of patience and equanimity. The calm that protects the effort of the path. so that it doesn't get you all frazzled and worn out. So these are the qualities that we will on the path. These are the qualities that lead to awakening. If we learn how to respect our freedom, then that puts us on the path so that we understand what's going on. Ultimately, of course, all of these qualities will bring us to something that's not willed at all, but we're not going to really see it. We're not going to be able to test it and understand what's willed and what's not willed until we learn to understand our will very thoroughly, how far it goes, what subtle levels of willing can happen in the mind. In other words, we have to push the envelope of our will. So ultimately, this truth of the will does finally lead to something totally unwilled. This is one of the paradoxes of the teaching, but one that the Buddha is very upfront about. You're looking for something unfabricated, but you have to fabricate the path. As he said, the highest of all fabrications, which is another word for the highest of all things you can will, is the Noble Eightfold Path. There is a Dhamma higher than that, totally unwilled, which is dispassion, the rest. That comes when you've succeeded in putting in the energy that's needed to will the path in a skillful way. What this means is that the choice is up to us which path we're going to follow, for there are many paths. There is a path that leads to hell. There's a path that leads to the animal rebirth. There is a path that leads to the human rebirth and divine birth, and there is a path that leads to total awakening. The Buddha set them all out. But it's up to us to choose. The Limits of Old Karma. January 29, 2009. Focus your attention on the breath and see how it feels. Where do you notice it in the body first? Where does it seem most prominent? You might notice the passage of the air through the nostrils, the rise and fall of the chest, the expansion of the ribcage. There are lots of different places in the body where you can sense the movement of the breath. Whichever area seems most prominent, focus there. And notice if the breath feels comfortable there. If it doesn't, you can let it change. Let it be longer or shorter, or think of it as becoming longer or shorter. You don't have to make it be that way or force it to be that way. Just pose that thought in mind. What would longer breathing be like? And you'll find the body will breathe longer. What would shorter breathing be like? Heavier, lighter, faster, slower? Explore the possibilities of the breath right now. Think of the breathing as a whole body process and see what that does to your sense of what kind of breathing feels best or what the body needs in terms of the breath. Sometimes it needs to be energized, sometimes relaxed. Get a sense of the breath potentials right now. We're sitting here with lots of different potentials in the body, potentials in the mind. As we meditate, we explore to see which potentials lead to the greatest happiness, the greatest pleasure. Allow the breath to be pleasurable and also notice what your mind is doing, what potentials you have in your mind. What thoughts could you be thinking right now? What qualities could you develop? At the moment, we're trying to emphasize the thoughts that focus you on the breath in the present moment, and we're trying to be inquisitive, trying to learn about the breath. Those two factors, thinking of the breath or focusing on the breath, and being inquisitive, count as directed thought and evaluation, two of the factors of jhana. Use them to see how you can stay with the breath in a way that feels comfortable, giving rise to feelings of refreshment and pleasure. And as you probe and explore, you begin to realize that there is this potential right here for the body to feel comfortable from the inside, for the mind to be willing to settle down. There are lots of other potentials you could have focused on right now. But you don't have to. Make the most of your freedom to focus on your ability to expand skillful potentials. Occasionally you'll find yourself running up against some blockages or pains that, no matter how skillfully you breathe, are going to stay as pains. Or there may be some chatter away in the mind that won't go away. You don't have to focus on it, just let it be there in the background. But it does impinge a little bit on your awareness. In other words, you find yourself running up against old karma obstructions. Fortunately, though, the present moment is not totally shaped by old karma. If it were, there'd be no point in practicing. There'd be nothing you could do. Everything would be determined by something that went before, which of course would have been determined by something that went before that, and on back in an infinite regress. This is why the Buddha rejected the idea that everything was determined by a creator, or everything was determined by old karma. Otherwise the practice would be pointless. But it's not pointless. We do have a measure of freedom here in the present moment. There may be some restrictions that come from past karma, but you can learn to work around them. This is a principle that applies across the board in the practice, not just while you're sitting here meditating, but in your activities throughout daily life. You find yourself running up against difficulties that, no matter how skillfully you try to respond to them, are still there. You have the choice of focusing on the difficulties to the point where you can't do anything about them, and get more and more entrapped and frustrated by them. Or if you try to ignore them and pretend they're not there, that doesn't work either. So you've got to find another approach. And fortunately, the best approach is always possible. The present moment is a limited moment, but it does have its openings. It does have its potentials. The wise approach is to admit the limitations, but also to want to explore the potentials for what's skillful. If you have certain responsibilities, learn how to carry them out, but at the same time, you're working on the qualities of the mind. That's what the Buddhist teachings about the paramis or the perfections are all about. Even as you go through your everyday responsibilities, you have the opportunity to develop good qualities of mind: patience, persistence, determination, truthfulness. Some of us have a romantic notion about the ideal situation to meditate. You're off by yourself. No responsibilities at all. Totally free to meditate all day long. But even in places like that, you find there are limitations, difficulties. And if the meditation is not going well, what do you have to blame it on? Can't blame it on anybody else. It's just yourself. I know a lot of monks who have been out in the forest. They say sometimes they can go for months and months and months with no progress in the meditation. So it's not the case that going off alone and having no responsibilities is going to solve everything. If you do have responsibilities, remind yourself that you don't have to carry them around in the mind all the time. Your outside work is your outside work. Your inside work can always keep going on, learning patience, learning to have a good humor about the whole thing. A couple years back, we had a problem in the electric room here. The county inspector came and said that it was totally unacceptable. Everything was going to have to be torn out and redone within just a few days. So a couple of the Americans came and worked on it and complained the entire time about how difficult it was, how much they were having to do without sleep, and just on and on and on. And it wasn't helping the job at all. I kept thinking about how things were over in Thailand when we'd have difficulties like that. People there seemed to have a much better humor about things. They seem to have a better understanding of the perfections, that even when things are difficult outside or inside, you've got the opportunity to develop good qualities of mind. Whatever the situation, you want to figure out the skillful way to approach it, so that you minimize the difficulties and maximize your potentials for freedom. If you're dealing with more than just present responsibilities, say, with the results of past mistakes where you've harmed people, the same principle applies. You admit the mistakes. You admit the limitations that they place on you now, but then you try to work around them. Don't let yourself be hemmed in by your past mistakes or be hemmed in by your past karma, because these things don't have to totally shape the present moment. We have some freedom right here, right now, and a lot of the practice is learning how to recognize that fact and maximize it to get the best use out of it. Because all the aspects of the path are possible, whatever the limitations from your past karma are. You can learn how to be generous. You can learn how to be virtuous. You can learn how to develop good qualities of mind. When you've made a mistake, you admit the fact. And you say, I'm going to learn from that. I'm not going to repeat that mistake. And that's as far as you have to go. You don't have to punish yourself, that somehow by feeling really, really sorry the punishment will go away. That's a dog's way of thinking. It knows it's done something bad. It gets on its back and wags its tail and looks really sorry, and hopes that by doing that it's going to appease you. But you're not a dog. You're a human being. As a human being, all you're asked is to recognize the mistake, resolve not repeat it, and then try to develop goodwill for yourself and for everybody else, for the people you've already wronged, for the people you might potentially wrong in the future. Spread goodwill to them, maintain that attitude of goodwill, and you'll be less likely to wrong them. Or even just the fact that you're sitting here in a human body. That has its limitations, but it has its potentials as well. If you're feeling trapped in the body, ask yourself, why are you trapped? Well, you have this perception that it's you. Or it's yours. You picked up the perception because there were times when it felt useful to identify with the body. It was a means for gaining pleasure. But now you're beginning to realize that identifying with the body has its drawbacks as well. As you get older, illness comes. Pains come. Even just the illness of hunger, the Buddha said, is the foremost illness. That's something we all suffer from every day, every day. This is why we have the reflection on the 4 requisites. If we didn't have food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, the body would die. We're born with these gaping needs. But at the same time, you can learn how to use the body as a basis for the practice. You can focus on the breath. As you get more and more sensitive to the breath, you can use the breath as a mirror for the mind. If you get into difficult situations with other people, you'll notice that there will be a change in your breath. What can you do to work with the breath in a way that you're focused not on the difficulties posed by that other person, but on the fact that you can still maintain your evenness of mind regardless of the situation outside? You can use the breath to help you with that. As you work with the breath, you begin to see the power of your perceptions in that the way you conceive of the breath is going to have an influence on how you actually breathe. If you think of the body as a big solid that you've got to push the breath through, it feels like this big lump of fat sitting here, and you're trying to force air through the fat. It just doesn't work. It's laborious. It's tiring. But if you perceive the body as an energy field when you breathe in, it's just more energy joining with the energy already there. It all flows in smoothly, and you don't have to push anything through anything else. It changes the way you breathe, changes the sensation of the breath. As you think of all the different energy channels in the body connecting together, it gets easier and easier for you not to have to breathe at all. The different parts of the body aren't fighting with one another. Your pores feel open. The breath comes in, goes out. Everything feels connected. Everything is charged with breath energy to the point where the breath gets more and more gentle, and finally grows still. A lot of this has to do with the perception you hold in mind. You begin to realize, as the sense of boundary around the body begins to dissolve, that your perception of being in the body was something you'd chosen to do. You're not really trapped in the body. You've trapped yourself, but you can free yourself. You can focus on space around the body, permeating throughout the body, between all the atoms. You can focus on the awareness that encompasses everything. Your sense of what's happening in the body is going to change. And that's just a concentration practice. But the potential for experiencing infinite space, or the potential for experiencing infinite consciousness, is all right here. You learn how to ferret it out and make the most of it. So this is how we live with our past karma. Accept whatever limitations there are, but also look for the areas that are not limited, to see in which direction freedom lies. This means that when you're accepting the situation in the present, it's partly accepting the limitations and learning how to be equanimous about them, but also accepting that there are lots of potentials for freedom here. If you really want true happiness, you try to make the most of those. The Dhamma is not for people who want to be told they just have to accept the way things are, and that'll be totally fine. The Dhamma doesn't stop right there, because the present moment is not always a wonderful moment. It can be pretty miserable. Ask the victims of torture, of natural disasters. But even in extremely miserable situations, the same principle holds. You accept your limitations, but you also accept that there are potentials for freedom, potentials for true happiness that can be developed. There's work to be done, but it's good work, regardless of the situation. If you keep that attitude in mind, you can practice the Dhamma and benefit from the Dhamma wherever you are. The Buddha's Investment Strategy. February 16, 2009. As you focus on the breath and stay with the breath, you're developing good qualities of mind, mindfulness, alertness. As you apply these qualities to the process of breathing, you'll see that it's a kind of fabrication. There's a willed and intentional element in there. And because there's an element of will, you can change it. You can find ways of calming it down. This way you give rise to discernment as well, leading to concentration. These two qualities, discernment and concentration, as they're supported by mindfulness and alertness, bring the mind to greater and greater stillness, greater and greater clarity. So as we're working with the breath, we're not just working with the breath. We're also gaining insight into the processes in the mind. This is a very useful and important investment of our time and energy. Sometimes you hear it said that when you meditate, you're not supposed to have any sense of gaining or getting anything out of the meditation. But that teaching is simply an antidote to the impatience we normally bring to the meditation. You do a little bit of meditation and you want to get lots and lots of results right away. So you've got to learn how to put that attitude out of your mind. But, still, there are returns, there are benefits that come from meditation. And it is an investment in something reliable. These qualities of mind, they stay with you whether the economy goes up, whether the economy goes down. And whether the body gets healthier, gets sick, or when it dies, the qualities you've invested in will stay with the mind. And so, given the fact we have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of energy, we want to make sure that we invest our time and energy in the most reliable things. If you invest in your attachments, you'll find that they give you some support for a certain amount of time, and then they start changing on you. As the Buddha said, everything fabricated, which means everything put together by causes, is inconstant. When you find yourself latching on to something inconstant, it can give you support only as long as it lasts, and then it's going to change. Even good qualities of the mind are inconstant, but the more you invest in them, the longer their impact, the longer their ability to support you, all the way through the process of aging, all the way through the process of illness, all the way through the process of death. These things stay there. And they can help you. The body is something you're going to have to let go of, and eventually you're going to have to let go of your memories, your thoughts, everything having to do with this life. At that point, the irrevocable quality of time really pushes itself on you. In terms of our day-to-day life, we tend to live in our narratives, our stories about this person, and the relationships we have with them, the things we've done. The reassuring quality of a narrative is that you can tell it again and again and again, and it seems to put this constant flow of time at bay for a while. But as things close down with the body, those narratives don't provide any help. In fact, they can make things even worse. The things you're going to miss, the things you're going to regret having done, will come pressing in on you. And you have to let go. If you haven't had any practice in letting go, it's going to be hard. So this is an important skill to invest in. Learning how to let go. The Buddha talks about different forms of wealth in the mind that you can invest in other words, qualities you can develop that can see you through, and the ability to let go is an important one. Discernment is another. The Buddha had a very pragmatic approach to truth. As we talk about the truth of our statements, the things that we say, to what extent can you encompass the truth of the experience in words? Poets struggle with this all the time, and are constantly admitting that words are poor when it comes to capturing the actual experience of something. Pictures are a poor rendition of experience. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but it can lie much more than 1,000 words, too. What's really real in life or the process is happening right here, right now, the way we create words, the way we use words, the way we use ideas, and then the impact they have in terms of causing stress and suffering, or alleviating stress and suffering. That's a truth, that's a reality, much truer than the words themselves. So you want to focus on really getting in touch with that reality. This doesn't mean that words are totally false. They convey some truth, and they're useful as tools. The impact they have on the mind is real. You look at the story of the Buddha's awakening. They say he had 3 knowledges in the course of that night. The first was looking back on his past lifetimes. You think you have narratives to deal with in your life. He suddenly remembered eons and eons of narratives where he had been, what he had been, his name, his appearance, the food he ate, the pleasure and pains that he'd experienced in that life, and then how he died. And then he moved on to another life, then another life. But that knowledge wasn't his awakening. So he went on to the second knowledge, which was knowledge of beings dying and being reborn all over the cosmos. In other words, moving from his own personal narrative, he went to a more general look at the cosmos as a whole, seeing that he wasn't the only one who was going through this process of repeated birth and death. Many beings, all the way from beings in hell, beings up to the various levels of heaven, even Brahmas, in states of infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception. They are all dying and being reborn, and moving around from level to level. Seeing all these movements, he was able to see that there was a general principle to them all, by looking at the cosmos as a whole. The general principle was that people suffered pleasure and pain because of their actions, their intentions, which in turn were determined by their views. If their views were wrong, in other words, if they felt that actions didn't have any impact, that it didn't really matter what you did, what you said, what you thought, they were going to suffer, because they were going to act on that belief and suffer from their lack of skill. If they believed that their actions did have an impact, were important, and it was important that you looked at your intentions, at your actions, and at their results, they'd experience pleasure. Even seeing that, though, still didn't put an end to his own suffering. But it did give him some clues. Views and intentions are important. And so in terms of the third knowledge that night, he started looking at his views, looking at his intentions, right in the present moment, seeing them as activities in the mind. These intentions, based on a misunderstanding of what suffering is, where it comes from, how it can be ended, lead to more suffering. The views that do understand where suffering comes from, lead you to make the intention of the path, to put an end to that suffering, based on correct understanding of how you've got to look at the processes here in the present moment, particularly seeing how craving arises, and how the mind flows with the craving, from moment to moment. As the Buddha later said, the way craving goes from moment to moment in this lifetime is the same process that's going to flow from the last moment of this life to the first moment of the next. So you've got your laboratory right here. We're not concerned with what you are, the concern is with what you do. And you can see that. What you are is an abstraction, but what you can do is something you can watch right here, right now. That's something you can always watch if you have the intention and the understanding that helps you realize that this is something important to look at. Most of the time, though, we tend to look at other things. We get wound up in all our other narratives, all our other views, which tend to deflect our intention from the present moment. The mind is like a politician. The politician is doing his dirty work, but he keeps diverting our attention, pointing out that those other people are horrible. Look at those horrible things other people are doing. But if you keep looking right here, right here, right here, staying with the breath, then because the breath is the closest thing to the mind, you begin to see the movements of the mind. You see how they cause suffering, and how they can put an end to suffering. That understanding is real. That process is something you really see, and it really happens. That's something you know for sure. William James, the philosopher, talks about what's called a pragmatic approach to truth. You realize that the truth of a statement can only be approximate. Words can never give a totally comprehensive account of reality. But watching the mind in the process of creating a statement, watching it in the process of creating any of its views about reality, you see that it really does have an impact. So the statement, even though it may only be an approximate truth, does lead to a certain type of action, and the action leads to certain type of result, which you can experience directly. The experience of that process is a truth of a different order. So it's important that you learn how to develop the ideas that will lead you to act in ways that put an end to suffering. If you encounter any idea that leads to more suffering, more ignorance, more craving, you don't have to hold on to it. You can let it go. So as we're sitting here, trying to stay focused on the breath and noticing when the mind wanders off. That ability to drop a thought mid-sentence, drop a thought even when it's all loose ends, is an important skill. You catch yourself in the middle of creating a little reality there, but then you can re-establish your frame of reference in the present moment. You get more and more skillful at letting go, able to catch yourself in these various processes more and more quickly, and you gain a deeper understanding of why you go for these things. All of these skills are going to stand you in good stead. They're good skills to invest in. So you need to make the time. The time isn't going to happen on its own. You have to make the time to practice. Create the time to practice. Open that space in your life so you can invest that time in the skills that are really going to be helpful all the way through. Because suffering is real, but the end of suffering is also real. That's why the time spent investing in understanding these things, mastering the skills for putting an end to suffering, is time well spent. You suffer less. The people around you suffer less as well. As you go through the process of aging, illness, and death, if you can manage your mind, the other problems that come up are going to be minor. So this is the Buddha's investment strategy. Invest in good qualities of the mind. Develop a mind that you can trust not to go flailing around when things get difficult. That's the wisest investment of all. As today's session comes to a close, we extend an invitation for continuous engagement. Just as Buddha encouraged sharing his teachings, we invite your active involvement. Contribute to disseminating these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your participation ensures these invaluable insights resonate widely. Seize this opportunity to spark positive change and foster understanding. We eagerly await your continued presence in future episodes, joining forces to enlighten minds and nurture compassion globally.